is the first in a series of webinars for the industry and government collaboration, which kicked off at our workshop on the 24th of June. Many of you will have been at that workshop, and we're recording this webinar for those who aren't able to attend. Now, following that workshop, these webinars address some of the questions which came up in our discussions, and the information we'll receive through the webinars will enable us all to prepare for our next workshop, which we're planning for the autumn. Today, this first webinar, as you can see, the keys to the Geothermal Treasure Chest, thank you, David, for that title, is about planning and regulation. At our workshop, we heard from Anna McLean and Katie Abraham, who both spoke briefly then, and their presentations ignited quite a lot of questions and a lot of interest. So today we'll hear in a bit more depth about some of the points that they were able to raise. And in addition, we're joined by Diane Steele from the Environment Agency, who was with us online at the workshop, and David Rutherford, partner at CMS. In terms of agenda, Anna will start giving some wider context on regulation, and then Diane will update us on some of the regulatory requirements for geothermal and also some amazing transformation work currently underway at the Environment Agency. After that, Katie will come back and speak about planning considerations and opportunities. And then finally, David will share some insights from his geothermal clients outside the UK. After that, we'll open the floor to your questions. We're using a slightly different system today for our webinar, so please use the Q&A button you should see at the top of your screen for your questions. And if the question is to a particular presenter, please add the name of the presenter. And also, if you have interest in a question that someone else poses, please like it to enable us to prioritise the questions at the end. So, in terms of introduction, that's it. I'm going to go on to the first slide, hopefully, and hand over to Anna to present the first section. Thank you very much, and I'll catch up with you at the end. Thank you. Anna.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, thanks, Anne. Yes, so yeah, I am Anna McLean. I am a lecturer at Newcastle University, but I've also engaged in research in relation to geothermal energy. So sorry, can we move on to my next slide, please? Thank you. Yes, I'm going to give a bit of an overview, first of all, as Anne says, about the regulation of geothermal. I'm going to just mention briefly, first of all, why we need to regulate, and then have a look at how geothermal energy is currently regulated, and then look at some of what the gaps and weaknesses and limitations of the current regulation are. So in terms of why we need to regulate, why is it important to regulate geothermal energy, then there are issues with regard to the environmental impacts of the extraction of geothermal energy. So it can have an impact on water in terms of over abstraction, contamination, etc. There's also issues with regard to compatibility with other users of the land itself or the area, neighbouring impacts on neighbouring land. There can be visual impacts and can be noise impacts. We also need to regulate who can access geothermal resources, who is allowed, who has the right to extract those geothermal resources, and also need to look at management of geothermal resources. So geothermal energy is a renewable resource, but it is possible to abstract at a rate that's greater than the regeneration rate. So there's issues there with regarding ensuring sustainable extraction rates, and also issues with regard to managing competing users of a particular geothermal resource. If you've got two operations abstracting from the same geothermal resource, to make sure that they don't impact negatively on one another. So how is geothermal energy currently regulated? There isn't a nice lovely Geothermal Act. What we have is a number of other legislative provisions that cover some of the different elements of geothermal extraction and use. So there is, from the environmental side of things, there is Environment Agency licenses and permits in relation to water abstraction and discharge. There's town and country planning law that deals with the planning permission and environmental impact assessment, where that is required. We have access to geothermal resources. So there's the Infrastructure Act 2015, Section 43, which gives general rights of access and general rights to access and extract from geothermal resources that are 300 metres or more below the surface. But there are also there are also maybe access requirements in terms of if you are accessing those geothermal resources within or through coal mines or the first 300 metres of somebody else's land, then there will be issues there with regard to other access permissions that you need to obtain. There is also health and safety law. There is general health and safety law with regard to workplace regulation. There are also some other health and safety regulations that were aimed at the oil and gas industry, which aren't directly applicable to geothermal, but are some of which are seen as good practice to comply with those health and safety laws. So there is a myriad of different regulatory regimes that cover different aspects of geothermal energy. Next slide, please. So what is the problem with that? What are the weaknesses in this current way in which geothermal energy is regulated? So lengthy and complex licensing and permitting process. So as you would have already gathered from what I just mentioned there are a number of different licenses and permits that need to be obtained if someone wants to set up a geothermal operation. There might be environment, water abstraction licenses, there might be discharge permits, there might be planning permission, landowner consent, etc. So lots of different steps that may need to be gone through before an operation can be up and running, and that can be lengthy and complex and is considered to be one of the barriers there to expansion of the geothermal industry. I know that work has been going on with the Environment Agency and the Mining Remediation Authority to try and simplify that and streamline that process. And I think Diane will talk about that when she speaks in a moment. It's also an issue there with the fact that we don't have any one body that's that has oversight of geothermal operations. We have some geothermal operations that might need an environment permit or license. There may be some operations that need planning permission, but where the planning permission is required, it's granted by local authorities as opposed to a central organisation. And there are some operations that won't require any license or permit. So there's no central register by which we can see what geothermal operations there are, and no central body collecting data. So there's no easily accessible general data and information about what's going on in terms of geothermal operations. It would be ideal to have something more central, something more comprehensive, even if you didn't have all geothermal operations requiring a permit or a license, if there was some sort of registration requirements, at least, so that there was some sort of record of what was going on, ideally with one regulatory body that could also act as that expert there in terms of contact with a member of the public or somebody who wanted to look at potentially setting up an operation, who they could go to if they had queries about how to go about that. It doesn't have to be setting up a new regulatory body. It could be having an existing body take over the regulation of geothermal energy. The Environment Agency is an obvious choice, but it needs to be a body, whoever it is, that's properly resourced there. In terms of guaranteeing access rights, that's an important issue as well, because a geothermal operator is going to want to know before they invest in a geothermal operation that they are going to have guaranteed access to the geothermal resources that they need to be able to have a viable operation. And in terms of and that the management of the geothermal resource is sustainable, and that their operation is not going to be adversely impacted by another operation setting up nearby. So the first step in enabling that really is to recognise geothermal heat, as a resource in its own right. At present, heat is generally recognised as a pollutant, but not as a resource in its own right. So recognising that would be the first step in being able to manage the resource. And then working out who owns that resource. The obvious option there is transferring to the state, as occurred with the oil and gas petroleum industry, so that then you've got state ownership of geothermal resources, and that can then be extraction can then be licensed out and managed in terms of extraction rates and managing different operations who are extracting from the same resource, being able to balance the rights of multiple users. And inspiration from this, as I mentioned, can come from oil and gas industry. But overall, I think the key point is we've got a bit of a disjointed, complex regulatory regime for geothermal energy, which also has gaps and weaknesses and limitations in it. So there is room for improvement, and I know that the work is underway there in terms of addressing some of those issues. And I think as will be touched upon in more detail by Diane and Katie and David in their presentations. Thank you.
Moving swiftly on, I'll hand over to our colleagues from CMS. Katie, do you want to do a quick introduction, and then I can move on to your slide?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, I'm Katie Abrahams. I'm a senior associate in the planning team at CMS. So if you can move on to the next slide there, Anne. There we go. So my part of the webinar is to focus on the practical reforms to the planning system that can unlock the potential of geothermal technologies. I'm going to run through and expand on a number of the points that I discussed at the roundtable, where I think that targeted changes can deliver fairly quick and meaningful progress. So the first point here on the slide is clear permitted development rights. There are currently some PD rights that geothermal developers can rely on, but they're fairly limited. And so this is something that government could look at to assist the industry. In terms of small-scale geothermal, there's a permitted development right for the installation, alteration or replacement of microgeneration ground source heat pumps, but there isn't a clear PD right for larger scale geothermal. And so what I'm suggesting here is introducing or extending potentially existing permitted development rights for other types of development to certain categories of geothermal development to remove the need for planning permission. So by way of example, Schedule 2, Part 17, Class K, permits development on any land consisting of A, the drilling of boreholes, B, the carrying out of seismic surveys, or C, the making of other excavations for the purposes of mineral exploration, and the provision or assembly on that land or an adjoining land of any structure required in connection with any of those operations. There are exemptions to this where development isn't permitted, as is quite usual. So if the excavation, for example, this is an example of a number, if the excavation would exceed 10 metres in depth or 12 square metres in surface area, it's not permitted. There are also conditions attached. So, for example, the development must cease no later than 6 months after the elapse of the relevant period, unless the Mineral Planning Authority have otherwise agreed in writing. There's also a Class J, which includes a PD right for the temporary use of land for mineral exploration. So introducing a similar PD right or tweaking these existing ones to expand them to beyond just mineral exploration to include geothermal exploration would, I think, help the industry. It would lower administrative burdens, cut the costs and speed up delivery. And I think it could be introduced fairly quickly through secondary legislation. There's also precedent for PD rights applying even if it is EIA development. For example, the Public Gas Transporter Pipeline Works EIA regs. And this is relevant because the EIA regs provide that deep drillings, which includes geothermal drilling, constitutes EIA development if the area of the works exceeds 1 hectare or if the drilling is within 100 metres of any controlled waters. And in this scenario, we would envisage the developer maybe sending the ES to DESNZ like a form of prior approval, as opposed to going through the local planning authority. So that it's all centralised again, as Anna was talking about, with local authorities and other consultees consulted on the form of ES. This would ensure that decisions are made by the appropriate body with the knowledge of this complex area, but without an accountability or a regulatory gap. DESNZ would also need to be responsible for any HRA approvals. DESNZ also plays a role in other energy planning, including for overhead lines for electricity infrastructure. And so this could be an attractive option and again could be introduced through secondary legislation. So just in terms of wrapping up this bullet point, if there were wider PD rights to support geothermal technologies, this would speed up delivery of geothermal developments and would remove some of the consenting uncertainty. Relying on PD rights would be much quicker and cheaper than either consenting geothermal developments through the TCPA regime or the alternative of obtaining a DCO, which could be pursued if a Section 35 direction was obtained. The next bullet point here is EIA assessment and guidance. So the publication of specific EIA guidance tailored to geothermal technologies would, I think, be useful. This should clearly clarify the scope and scale of assessments required, drawing on best practice from other low carbon sectors. The third bullet point down goes to strong policy support for geothermal, and the NPPF does include deep geothermal heat within the definition of renewable and low carbon energy, but it would be very helpful if national planning policy explicitly recognised the role of geothermal in achieving net zero and energy security. As we discussed at the roundtable, the industry would benefit from strong policy support from government. Again, this is something that I think could be done fairly quickly and easily. Any geothermal specific policy should obviously include clear support for geothermal development, setting out its benefits and the need for a positive approach to applications. This would aid investor confidence in the sector and would send a strong signal to decision makers and developers and help ensure consistency in decision making across the country. And the last bullet point that I have here is the use of land at depth in Scotland. And as we discussed at the roundtable, section 43 to 45 of the Infrastructure Act 2015 grants a statutory right to use deep level land, which is defined as below 300 metres, for petroleum and geothermal exploration and development. And this removes the need to acquire easements compulsorily or to negotiate rights with individual landowners. And it was introduced in England and Wales following the Starr case, which confirmed that drilling through land at depth without consent could amount to trespass. The provisions of the 2015 Act don't extend to Scotland, where this is devolved, and the Scottish Government hasn't introduced equivalent legislation, which means that developers would be required to obtain voluntary agreements from all affected parties. And I flagged this as this is an area that I think the Scottish Government could look at to assist the industry. I will now pass on to David, who will look at some international perspectives for us.
Thank you, Katie. And just by way of a quick introduction from me, I'm David Rutherford. I'm a partner in the energy team at CMS in London. What I'm going to do is just go through some of the feedback we've had from clients and other actors that we've had operating in the sector in other jurisdictions, and then draw together some of the best of their experiences and some of the suggestions that they've had for how the UK might want to go forward, particularly in terms of policy support. The first point, where is this treasure chest that we're talking about in terms of in the regulatory map? Well, it's somewhere in the overlap of a Venn diagram of subsurface mining regulations, heat regulations, which might include competition, monopoly laws, and finally town and city planning laws. So it's somewhere in the overlap of those three. From the people we've been speaking with, the closer you go towards good regulation of the subsurface risks, the better it seems to be. The regulatory regimes are clearer. They take less time to go through the process. And I'll just use a couple of examples right at our doorstep of Germany and Denmark. So first, Germany. This is one of the largest users of geothermal, particularly for heat, in Europe. Its regulatory process is very slow. It is very orientated towards the local authorities leading the approval processes, where there are a small number of people However interested they might be in the projects, they only have so much time during their days. I understand that they even still use paper-based application systems, so you can't use anything online in parts of Germany. But just this month, Germany, the German Economics Ministry has proposed a geothermal acceleration law, which does a number of things. First, it ensures that geothermal is labelled as an overriding public interest alongside solar and wind. So that's now a third pillar of their green energy commitments. It supports regional heat networks and reduces the red tape. So it really does expedite the development of these projects. One could contrast that with Denmark, where the experience is much more straightforward, because whilst it does have local authority elements, it's much more centralized in terms of who makes the decisions, who drives this. It's the central regulator on the subsurface side of things. And they introduced regulations in 2023, which have been very well received by the industry there. They were made mostly around pricing, so pricing regulations to balance the need to protect consumers with those subsurface risks and the need to have a long-term stable regulatory framework, because you need that to give the larger scale investors the incentive to make those investments. I'd like to contrast those sort of neighbour examples with that of Western Australia. So Western Australia has a fully blown regulatory regime in a Petroleum and Geothermal Resources Act, 1967. So that is a detailed regulatory regime. Out of interest, according to Western Australian government's website, how many commercial geothermal plants do you think there are? I shall give you a clue. It's the same answer as it was in 1967. There are none. So whilst, in the view of the people we've been speaking to, having a clear regulatory regime is necessary, in and of itself, particularly at this stage for the UK, in and of itself, it's insufficient, because you need that policy support, as has been mentioned previously. And on policy support, there are about 100 countries that do this for wind and solar, but only 30 for geothermal. And sort of collating the recommendations of the various actors we've spoken to, they've said the following in terms of advice to the UK on this. First, move geothermal up the renewable agenda and recognise it for what it is. It's a firm, baseload, dispatchable, low emission energy source. And when you combine that with some of the low-hanging regulatory fruit we've been talking about, that will give developers something to point to when they approach local councils or perhaps the land managers for various landowners in the countryside to say, look, this is actually on a policy footing as something that is worthwhile doing and has government attention. There should also be support for innovation and skill sets. There is a concern in, let's call them Western countries, that there's been a severe drop in the number of students attending university for geological degrees because of its perceived connection to oil and gas. It would be a great shame if that was lost, because whilst it's quite possible to transfer from oil and gas now, you'll have the senior engineers without the junior ones coming up. So that need that sort of at that younger age of the sort of education spectrum, a bit of support and flying the flag needs to be done. And finally, it's risk mitigation. So yes, we are talking about money at the end of the day, particularly for the early stages of projects. So that might take the form of grants, which is how it's done in Austria, subsidized loans, what they do in Indonesia, public insurance. So if the well turns out not to be that good, part of the cost is paid for. So that's what the Dutch have been doing for a number of years. Some of the people we spoke to even wondered, could Great British Energy undertake the actual exploration activities? I think that's a great idea, but maybe an initial step might be for GB Energy to collate what survey data there is available, and or do what happens in America, purchase or enter some sort of deal with oil and gas companies which already have this data. Okay, so there are a few things to do there, and really from the people we spoke to, the key to the treasure chest really is to get these initial policy support elements in there, so that then you have projects that have started, you have a body of information upon which then to regulate.
Let's have a look. Please add any questions you have to the Q&A section.
One for you, Anna, that says, do you know if heat is considered as a resource in the EU or other areas of the globe? It's from Keith Wise.
There are some countries that recognise heat as a resource and that licence it, yes. Yeah, so there is certainly scope for us to look at what's been going on in other jurisdictions. Yeah.
There's a question for Diane. Can you see that, Diane?
Yes, yes, it's asking, is there a depth below which we would automatically accept there's no risk? The answer to that is no, not anymore. So the historically, very back in the days of the really early schemes, that was the case, but with the introduction of the Water Framework Directive and the Infrastructure Act, then we are required to look at all schemes now. But we do take each scheme sort of, and particularly the deeper schemes that might pose lower risk on a case-by-case basis. So you probably wouldn't have, if there's no receptors and no low risk, then you would just have to do a short risk assessment rather than the whole full-blown process. Because not only are we considering impact to the water resource itself, then we're now looking at other users. And so in a lot of these areas, in the deeper areas, and we're seeing multiple schemes. So if we give, like, if you take water, then you almost get like a protected right. So you get a protected, what we call a protected right once you get an abstraction license, which means that we can't allow anybody else to, like, any other user to derogate that. So so then we would be doing that assessment to make that some, like, the next scheme to come along wouldn't be sucking your well dry or interfering with the sort of integrity of you getting that water. So we have to do that assessment. So if it doesn't fall in with one of the exemptions, then if it was low risk, it would just be more of a lighter touch assessment that you require.
Okay, thanks for managing that, Katie. I can now see a couple of questions. I don't know if you can, Diane, because there's another one for you. Well, I presume Gerald's question is for you, not for Sally. You covered radioactive substances such as naturally occurring radioactive material. Is there any requirement to sample produced waters, and should lithium concentration be included?
So yes, so it depends. So there's a requirement for the discharge permit to take samples and determine what the chemistry is and whether there's any chemical changes from abstracting to discharge. If it's just going through the heat exchanger, that might not be the case. If you substantially change the temperature, we ask for just an assessment of whether that has any chemical implications on it. With radioactive substances particular, that's a whole different set of regulations, and within that it sets out limits. So if it has like a list of about 30 sort of different substances, and if you can manage to have it so that you're picking up lower than those limits, then you don't have to, that's fine. If it's higher than those limits, then you will have to get a radioactive substances permit and sort of prove that you're managing the risk from that. I think one of the biggest issues that we have for the deeper schemes is the transmission at surface, or making sure that the wells are constructed good enough so that either particularly in the reinjection wells, that they're not causing a pathway to surface receptors. We're seeing a lot of the sort of reinjection into sort of where the water table is very high, close to surface, even on sort of 1 to 3 kilometre wells. We get, you know, you see sort of water, like sort of pressure heads, sort of and piezometric sort of water levels of sort of less than 5 metres to ground. And when you're trying to force the water in, then, you know, there's the concern that, you know, that if you don't construct the boreholes well enough, that you know, they could get out to the shallow aquifers. So it's, I think that's probably the sort of greatest concern that we've got, and also trying to get that water back in, that you're not going to cause sort of seismic impacts or sort of interfere with the well integrity by exceeding those pressures. So I think that's one of the biggest things. But particularly with all the other net zero activities coming on, like the carbon capture and storage, then we're seeing in some key areas, then there's almost like clusters of activities, and we have to sort of consider the interference between all the different schemes.
Okay. And you did mention seismicity there. Gus's question on regulation on induced seismicity. Do you have some information on that?
So that's, we don't specifically look at that. So that would generally fall under the planning authority if they would consider the risks. So it's not something that we pick up. If we think there's a consideration that it could impact on, say, the source pathway receptor, so that the seismic would result in the creation of a pathway for sort of poorer quality water to get to the surface, then we would consider that. But the direct impacts, we would leave to the local authority to do.
Okay. Anna, do you have any further insight on that?
No, and I would say agree and support what Diana said, and just sort of it just feeds into this idea that of local authorities and the environment agencies there to deal, as Diana's mentioned, in primarily to do with the water, protection of the water, and not the other environmental issues that may arise if responsibility for that falls on to local authorities. And there's a question there about expertise. And also between about consistency between the approaches of different local authorities. You know, if you've got different local authorities might take different approaches and be more pro geothermal or otherwise. So you know, you might not get that consistent approach between the different local authorities.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. A final question at the moment. As I said, if anyone else has any questions, please add. But for Katie, probably Katie or David, on subsurface trespass, can you comment on the issue of subsurface trespass in Scotland as a result of them not adopting relevant clauses in the Infrastructure Act?
Yes, I think this is from Tony, and who's no doubt very familiar with the relevant case. Obviously, it's very useful provision, section 43 to 45 in England and Wales, but there is a gap in Scotland because you don't have this statutory right to use a deep level land below that 300 metre threshold for geothermal. So yeah, as you've identified, Tony, there is a risk in Scotland of trespass if you don't get the consent. So it does mean that you have to negotiate those land rights with individual landowners in Scotland if you want to use land at depth. So there is certainly a gap there, and it's whether it's something that the Scottish Government is minded to plug.
I think it's worth bearing in mind that some of the relevant legislation here in Scotland goes back to 1865, which, as you might expect, doesn't envisage this sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's something for Scotland to think about.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think we've got a couple of attendees from our Scottish Government, and indeed at our next webinar we're going to be looking at country-specific regulations and situations across the UK. So thank you for that. So there are no more questions I can see in the chat anyway, so if there are any final questions, please let me know. In the meantime, Thomas has just added a question which we can send across. I'll read that out. Is there a risk that between permitting, consenting for water abstraction and planning connections for electrical connection that large-scale geothermal extraction struggles to get started? Is there a way of getting different state bodies to streamline this? Who would like to take this one? Anna? I think we've mentioned this already in certain areas, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the key issues is the multiple permits and licenses that need to be obtained for the different elements of a geothermal operation. And it would be great if all the different regulators were talking to each other and had a united approach, united front on it. In an ideal world, and I think that's one of the things I mentioned about, in an ideal world you would have a geothermal regulator, so one regulator who could deal with all those aspects. I think that's highly, or who could sort of at least oversee those different elements and be that one point of contact, that one body that sort of coordinated the different aspects. I don't know whether the industry as it is in its emerging phase is substantial enough to justify that at the moment, and whether it's something that just needs to be worked towards.
Yeah, it was very interesting hearing your comments, David, on the Danish solution and the solution that they've brought forward. So it'd be interesting to hear from them, I suppose, in the future to look at best practice elsewhere. Right. Anyone else from the panel have anything to add to those questions before I move to closing remarks? No, I think we've covered everything. Thank you very much, everybody. But just before we close, a quick look ahead to our next meetings. We've mentioned this is the first in a series of webinars. The next one I mentioned briefly earlier will probably be on the 9th of September. I'll confirm as soon as I can. And this is kind of trip round our 4 nations to see the status quo, to see good practice around the UK and in the 4 countries of the UK, what we can share, where we're up to, what's devolved, what isn't devolved. I think that's going to be quite interesting overview. The following webinar, and I haven't got Denmark on my list of invitees, but I might speak to somebody in Denmark, is looking at learnings from Europe in geothermal, and that will be on the 16th of September. Just a high-level overview, but once we get that big picture, then we can drill down and get some more detail as we go through this process. So as I mentioned at the beginning, these webinars are kind of to set us up and to give us some information to make our work at our next in-person workshop as effective as possible. And I'm currently working with Desnes and several other people in the room today on the agenda and the format of this next in-person meeting, also taking account of some of the feedback that people have been given after the last meeting. The in-person meeting will probably be on the 6th of October, and that will be in London. Again, details as soon as I can send them. Just a shout out to everybody. We're keen to make this collaboration as impactful as possible. It's really exciting that we are working together across industry with our legal friends, with government to move geothermal forward. But the best way to make this as effective as possible is to get input from across the group. So please continue to get in touch with any comments, feedback or ideas for our work together to make it as effective as possible. Well, it just remains for me to say thank you to all our presenters, to Anna, Diane, Katie and David. Thank you very much to Michelle for your work behind the scenes. That's been invaluable. And thank you to all of our listeners and participants in the discussion today. Have a lovely summer, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.